Welcome to Windy Night Stories. Tonight's story is by George Manville Fenn, Haunted by Spirits. But what an out-of-the-way place to get to, I said, after being most cordially received by my old schoolfellow and his wife, one bitter night after a long ride. But you really are glad to see me, eh? Now, hold your tongue, do, cried Ned and his wife in a breath. You won't get away again in under a month, so don't think of it. But where we're going to put you, I don't know, said Ned. Oh, I can sleep anywhere. Chairs, table, anything you like. Only make me welcome. Fine old house this seems, but however came you to take it? Got it cheap, my boy. Been shut up for 20 years. It's haunted, and no one will live in it. But I have it full for this Christmas, at all events. And what's more, I have some potent spirits in the place, too, but they are all corked down tightly, so there is no fear at the present. But I say, Lily, cried Ned, addressing his wife, why, we shall have to go into the haunted room and give him our place. That you won't, I said. I came down here on purpose to take you by surprise, and to beg for a snack of dinner on Christmas Day, and now you are going to give me about the greatest treat possible, a bed in a haunted room. What kind of ghost is it? You mustn't laugh, said Ned, trying to appear very serious, for there is not a living soul within 10 miles of this place that would not give you a long account of the horrors of the Red Chamber, of spots of blood upon the bedclothes coming down in a regular rain, noises, clashing of swords, shrieks and groans, skeletons or transparent bodies. Oh, my dear fellow, you needn't grin, for it's all gospel truth about here, and if we did not keep that room screwed up, not a servant would stay in the house. Wish I could buy it and take it away, I said. I wish you could indeed, cried Ned cordially. Half an hour after, Ned and I were busy with screwdriver and candle, busy in the large corridors, turning the rusty screws which held a large door at the extreme end of the house. First one and then another was twirled out till nothing held the door but the lock, the key for which Ned Harrington now produced from his pocket, an old, many-warded, rusty key, at least a couple 100 years old. Hold the candle a little lower, said Ned. There's something in the keyhole. When pulling out his knife, he picked out a quantity of paper, evidently very recently stuffed in. He then inserted the key, and after a good deal of effort it turned, and the lock shot back with a harsh, grating noise. Ned then tried the handle, but the door remained fast, and though he tugged and tugged, it still stuck, till I put one hand to help him, when our united efforts made it come open with a rush, knocking over the candle, and there we were, standing upon the portal of the haunted room in the dark. I'll fetch a light in a moment out of the hall, said Ned, and he slipped off, while I must confess to a certain feeling of trepidation on being left alone, listening to a moaning, whistling noise, which I knew to be the wind, but which had, all the same, a most dismal effect upon my nerves, which, in spite of my eagerness to be the inmate of the closed room, began to whisper very strongly that they did not like it at all. But the next minute Ned was beside me with the light, and we entered the gloomy, dusty old chamber, a bed-chamber furnished after the fashion of the past century. The great four-poster bed looked heavy and gloomy, and when we drew back the curtains, I half expected to see a body lying in state, but no, all was very dusty, very gloomy, and soul-chilling, but nothing more. Come, there's plenty of room for a roaring fire, said Ned, and I think after all we had better come here ourselves and let you have our room. That you will not, I said determinedly. Order them to light a fire, and have some well-aired things put upon that bed, and it will be a clever ghost that wakes me tonight, for I'm as tired as a dog. Here, Mary, shouted Ned to one of the maids, coals and wood here, and a broom. We waited about, peering here and there at the old toilet-ware and stands, the old chest of drawers and armoire, old chairs and paintings, for all seemed as if the room had been suddenly quitted, while inside a huge cupboard beside the fireplace hung a dusty horseman's cloak, and in the corner were a long, thin rapier and a quaint old-fashioned firelock. Strikes chilly and damp, said I, snuffing the smell of old boots and fine dust. Ah, but we'll soon drive that out, said Ned. But you'd better give in, my boy. 'Pon my word, I'm ashamed to let you come in here. Pooh, nonsense, I said. Give me a roaring fire, and that's all I want. Ah, cried Ned, but what a while that girl is. And then he stepped out into the passage. Why, what are you standing there for? He cried. Come and light this fire. Please, sir, I dustn't, said the maid. Here, give me hold, cried Ned in a pet, and send your mistress here. And then he made his appearance with a coal scuttle, paper, and wood, when between us we soon had a fire alight and roaring up the huge chimney, while the bright flames flickered and danced, and gave quite a cheerful aspect to the place. Well, cried Mrs. Harrington, who now appeared, how are you getting on? But neither Ned's wife nor her sister stood looking, for, in spite of all protestations, dressed as they were, they set to sweeping, dusting, airing linen, bed, mattress, etc. We helped to the best of our ability, for no maid, either by threats or persuasion, would enter the place, and at last we made the place look, if not comfortable, at all events less dismal than before we entered. The old blinds came down like so much tinder when touched, while, as to the curtains, the first attempt to draw them brought down such a cloud of dust that they were left alone, though Mrs. Harrington promised the place should be thoroughly seen to in the morning. Returning to the drawing-room, the remainder of the evening was most agreeably spent, while the cause of my host and hostess's prolonged absence produced endless comments and anecdotes respecting the Red Chamber, some of them being so encouraging in their nature that Ned Harrington, out of sheer compassion, changed the conversation. Well, my boy, said Ned, when the ladies had all retired for the night, you shan't go to bed till the witching hour is past. So he kept me chatting over old times till the clock had gone 1, the big old turret clock, whose notes flew booming away upon the frosty air. Christmas Eve tomorrow, so we'll have a tramp on the moors after the wild ducks. Plenty out here. I say, my boy, I believe this is the original moated grange, so don't be alarmed if you hear the mice. There's only one thing I care for, I said, and that is for anything in the shape of a practical joke. Honor bright, my boy, said Ned. You need fear nothing of that kind. And then I was alone in the haunted chamber, having locked myself in. My first proceeding was to give the large fire an extra poke, which sent a flood of light across the room, and the flames gushing up the chimney. My next, to take one of the candles and make a tour of my bedroom, during which I looked under the bed, behind the curtains, into the armoire and cupboard, but discovered nothing. Next I tried the windows, through which I could just dimly see the snow-white country, but they were fast and blackened with dirt. The chimney glass, too, was so injured by damp that the dim reflection given back was something startling, being more like a bad photograph of life-size than anything else. And at length, having fully made up my mind that I was alone, and that, as far as I could make out, there were neither trapdoors nor secret passages in the wall, I undressed, put out the candles, and plunged into bed. But I was wrong in what I had said to my host about sleeping, for I have never felt more wakeful in my life. I watched the blaze of the fire sink down to a ruddy glow. The glow turned blacker and blacker, till at last the fire was all but extinct, while the room was as dark as could be. But my eyesight was painfully acute, while my hearing seemed strained to catch the slightest passing sound. The wind roared and rumbled in the great chimney, and swept sighing past the windows, and, though it had a strange, wild sound with it, yet I had heard the wind before, and therefore paid but little heed to its moans. All at once the fire seemed to fall together with a tinkling sound. A bright flame leaped up, illuminating the room for a moment, then becoming extinct, and leaving all in darkness. But there was light for a long enough interval for me to see, or fancy I saw, the cupboard door open, and the great horseman's cloak stand out in a weird-like manner before me, as though covering the shoulders of some invisible figure. I felt warm, then hot, then in a profuse perspiration, but I told myself it was fancy, punched my pillow, and turned over upon the other side to sleep. Now came a long, low, dreary moan, hollow and heart-rending, for it seemed like the cry of someone in distress, when I raised myself up on one elbow and listened. Old Cowl on a Chimney, I muttered, letting myself fall back again, now thoroughly determined to sleep. But the moaning continued. The wind whistled and howled, while now came a gentle tap, tap, tapping at my window, as if someone was signaling to be admitted. Tap, tap, tap. Still it kept on, as though whoever tapped was fearful of making too much noise, and at length, nerving myself, I slipped out of bed, crossed the room, and found that the closet door was open. But a vigorous poke inside produced nothing but dust and 2 or 3 very sharp sneezes. So I fastened the door and listened. All silent. But the next moment began the tapping upon the dirty window pane again, and, impelled by a mingled sensation of fear and attraction, I crept closer to the sash, and at length made out the shadow of something tapping at the glass. Bah! Bah! I exclaimed the next moment as I shuffled across the room and back to my bed. Strand of ivy in the wind. But I was not to be at peace yet, for now there came a most unmistakable sound from the wainscot, louder and louder, as if someone were trying to tear a piece of the woodwork down. The place chosen seemed to be in the corner beside the cupboard, and at last, having made up my mind that it was the rats, I dropped off to sleep, and slept soundly till morning, when I heard the cheery voice of my host at the door. "Oh, all right," he said as I answered. "I only came because the girl knocked and said that something must be the matter, for she could not make you hear." On descending to breakfast, I found that I was to undergo a rigorous cross-examination as to what I had seen and heard. But one elderly lady present shook her head ominously, freely giving it as her opinion that it was little better than a sacrilege to open the haunted chamber, and finishing a very solemn peroration with the words, "Stop a bit, they don't walk every night." This was encouraging, certainly, but in the course of the afternoon I went up to my room, and found that it had been well cleaned out, while many little modern appliances had been added to the dingy furniture, so that it wore quite a brightened appearance. The insides of the windows had been cleaned, and a man was then upon a ladder polishing away at the exterior, when I drew his attention to a number of loose ivy strands, which he cut off. In the cupboard I found plenty of traces of rats in the shape of long gnawed-off fragments of wood pushed underneath the skirting board, while, upon holding my head against the chimney, the groaning of the cowl was plainly to be heard as it swung round dolefully upon some neighboring chimney. A pleasant day was spent, and then, after a cozy evening, I was once more ushered into the chamber of horrors, this time being escorted by the whole of the visitors, the gentlemen affectionately bidding me farewell, but not one seeming disposed to accept my offer of changing rooms. However, Ned and Mrs. Harrington both wished me to go to their room, when I of course refused, and once more I was alone. It was now about 12:30, and Christmas morning. A regular storm was hurrying round the house, and a strange feeling of crepitation came upon me when I had extinguished the light. And then on climbing into bed I sat and listened for a while, laid my head upon my pillow, and the next moment, or what seemed the next moment, I was startled by a strange beating sound, and as I became aware of a dim, peculiar light penetrating the room, I heard a low, muffled voice cry appealingly, "Your hot water, sir, 7:45, while I could hardly believe my eyes had been closed. Christmas Day passed as it generally does in the country, that is to say, in a most jovial, sociable way, and after fun, frolic, sport, pastime, forfeit, dance, and cards, I stood once more within the haunted chamber with a strange sensation upon me that though I had met with nothing so far to alarm me, this night, a night when, of all nights in the year, spirits might be expected to break loose, I was to suffer for my temerity. As soon as I entered and secured the door, I felt that something was wrong, but I roused up the fire, lit the wax candle upon the dressing table, and then looked round the room. Apparently I was alone, but upon opening the big closet door, the great cloak fell down with a ghostly rustle, while a peculiar odor seemed to rise from the heap. The long, thin sword, too, fell, with a strange clanging noise, as I hastily closed the door, and then setting down the candle tried to compose myself to look at matters in a calm, philosophical manner. But things would not be looked at in that way, and now I began to feel that I was being punished for all, since the next moment I could see the eyes of the large portrait between the windows gleam and roll, now showing the whites, now seeming to pierce me, so intense was their gaze. Then the figure seemed to be slowly coming down from the frame nearer and nearer, till it was close to me, when it slowly receded, and a shade passed over the canvas, so that it was gone. But for shame and the fear of ridicule, I would have opened the door and cried for aid. In fact, I believe I did rise from the chair and try to reach the door, but some invisible power drew me into a corner of the room, where I leaned panting against the wall to gaze upon a fresh phenomenon. I had brought a chamber candlestick into the room, and after igniting the pair of candles upon the toilet table, placed the flat candlestick between them, and left it alight. But now, yes, I rubbed my eyes. There was no mistake. There were 6 candles burning. I started, shook myself, muttering that it was deception. But no, there burned 6 candles, while their flames were big and blurred with a large, ghastly blue halo around each that had a strange, weird light. And now I tried to recall what I had read in old ghost stories about corpse candles, for I felt that these 3 must be of that character. In an agony of fear, I tried to run up to the dressing table to dash the weird lights over, but again the strange influence guided my steps, so that I curved off to the bed, where I sat down, trembling in every limb, limbs that refused their office, while I gazed upon the candles which now began to float backwards and forwards before me, till I could bear the strange sight no more, and throwing myself back, I buried my face in the bed. But there was no relief here, for as I threw myself down at full length, the great bedstead gave a crack, a rattle, and a bound, and then in an agony of dread I was clinging to the bedding, for the huge structure began to rise slowly higher, sailing away apparently upon the wings of the wind, and again sinking lower and lower and lower to interminable depths, so that I involuntarily groaned and closed my eyes. But that was of no avail, for I could feel the great bedstead career, now on one side, now on the other, and ever going onward through space like some vessel upon a vast aerial sea. The rapid gliding upward, in spite of the dread, seemed attended with somewhat an exhilarating effect, but the falling was hideous to the extreme, for now it was slowly and gently, but the next moment the speed was fearful, and I lay trembling in expectation of feeling the structure dash upon the ground, while every time I unclosed my eyes, I could see the gyrating candles, and turned giddy with confusion. And now, with one tremendously swift gliding swoop, away we went, faster and faster, more rapidly than swallows upon the wing. Space seemed obliterated, and, by the rushing noise and singing in my ears, I could feel that the bedstead was careering on where the atmosphere was growing more and more attenuated, while soon, from the catching of my breath, I felt sure that we should soon be beyond air altogether. The candles were gone, but there were stars innumerable, past which we sped with inconceivable rapidity, so that their light seemed continued in one long, luminous streak, while ever more and more the speed was increasing, till it seemed that we were attached to some mighty cord, and being twirled round and round with frightful velocity, as if at the end of the string. And now I trembled for the moment when the cord should be loosed, and we should fly off into illimitable space, to go on forever. At last it came, and away I went, but now separated from the bedstead, to which I had clung to the last. On, with something large and undefined in front of me, which I felt that I should strike, though I was powerless to prevent the collision. Nearer, but ever darting along like a shooting star in its course, I was swept on, till, with a fearful crash, I struck what I now found to be the lost bed, and tried to cling to it once more. But no, I rolled off, and fell slowly and gradually lower, and evidently out of the sphere of the former attraction, so that at last I fell, with only a moderate bump, upon the floor, when, hastily rising, I found all totally dark, and that the bedpost was beside me, when, shudderingly dragging off some of the clothes onto the carpet, I rolled myself in them, and went off into a heavy sleep. The next morning several of my friends made remarks upon my pale and anxious looks, and soon after breakfast Ned beckoned me into his study and begged of me to tell him whether I had been disturbed. For a few minutes I felt that I could not tell of the horrors of the past night, even though I had vowed to sleep in the haunted room still. But at last I began my recital, and had arrived at the point when the bedstead set sail, when Ned jumped up, crying, "Why, I thought from your looks that you really had been disturbed. But I say, old boy, I suppose we must look over it, as it's Christmas. But, do you know, judging by my own feelings, I think I'd better make the punch rather less potent tonight." "Well, really," I said, "I think so too." "Do you?" said Ned. "Oh, yes," I said, "for my head aches awfully, and no wonder, seeing as how it had been haunted by spirits." The end.